Basically, what I wanted to ask you about was psychological disorders and how, like, the whole argument is they genetic or environmental.
Oh.
Yeah, basically, I had a couple questions.
Okay.
First one, I was wondering if you think the whole genetic versus environmental thing is linked to the MC, the trust versus mistrust. You know, the whole
But with
list.
Eric Erickson,
With Eric Erickson.
no, really. In the past, psychologists used a medical approach to looking at psychological disorders, and even further back than that, they looked at what they called a demonological approach, which is more spiritual. Okay, so Eric Erickson isn't looking at psychopathology at all. He's really looking at more on how we're going to optimize healthy development. So he wouldn't necessarily, from his perspective, look at that biological approach. He calls his a psychosocial, which means he's just looking at the psyche and the social relationships that we have. Now, he would argue, however, if those psychosocial connections didn't occur, then there's the possibility of developing some kind of neurosis or some kind of psychopathology.
Right, you were saying how people way back they used to look at it at a medical standpoint. So, do you view mental illness as a curable illness rather than a irreversible condition?
I do not look at it as a curable thing, but as a manageable. If we look at it from curing, then we would be looking at it from a medical model, which looks at it as from this disease where you can give medicine and then it'll all be fixed. But because we're dealing with the mind and the psyche, psychologists typically look at it as the disruption and disorder of things. Okay, so yes, we can get behaviors under control, we can get our thinking under control, but the only disorders that are biological in their causation are the dementias.
So do you think, since like you were saying that it's like manageable, do you think people don't get the proper treatment or proper care what they need, since most people, I like to say, they minimize the disease in a sort of way. You know how like with OCD and depression, people be like, oh, I'm OCD, but they're not actually have any compulsive behaviors. They just like to keep things neat and tidy.
Well, that's very possible. We all have our little quirks. For example, my mother, one time a person told her that she was germophobic, but she's not germophobic. She's just peculiar. Okay, and so her favorite scent is eau de Clorox because she's just spraying everything. And so one of the big problems, of course, with psychopathology is the whole labeling and the lack of understanding that people have about it. And so people can get diagnosed with a psychological disorder, deny that they have the psychological disorder, and not engage in health-seeking behaviors.
Speaking of that, it was a thing I looked up, Rosenhan's experiment on the fake pseudo patients, but at the same time, I was thinking about it, like how they still admonished people even though they didn't have the mental illness. Then he said, since due to that, people weren't getting the proper treatment. But at the same time, do you think many people were admitted because that's like the people's job? They went in thinking that some of these people had mental illness.
Probably so. That whole preconceived notion about what the disorders look like, okay, and what the whole faking of disorders and faking of symptoms is called malingering. And so people can do that. They can fake them to the point where they can actually fool the attending physician. And so that research is very interesting, as the physicians argued foul on sending them into the institution, but the researchers cried foul too, because they argued where you weren't being attentive enough and just was looking at everything filtering it through this specific lens without looking at the person as an individual.
But at the same time, since the people who did not have the mental disorders, they was admitted, couldn't that lead to them causing mental disorders due to the theory of the connection between a learned behavior and cognition, observable behavior causing a phobia or mental disorder?
Yeah, well, some of the people did leave out of the experiment, largely because they couldn't take the pressure of being in an institution. But if I understand your question correctly about whether or not some behaviors can be learned, absolutely. There's research that on depressed mothers and their toddlers, and it showed that the toddlers learned the depressive behaviors of their mothers. Okay, so it's very possible through classical conditioning, through reinforcement, to actually learn those kinds of behaviors.
But at the same time, isn't that like acquired anxiety versus biological perspectives, like such as people who have never seen a snake, but they have fear of a snake, and that's due to the theory that people think, like, back in old days, people around the area had lots of snakes, like the preconceived notion, like, basically what I'm thinking of, it's like in biology with the theory of adaptability and stuff, like, since such and such, these amount of animals were killed by snakes, the next set of animals knew how to overcome the fact that they was getting eaten by snakes.
Yeah, and some of the research, though, shows that our brain is hardwired for some fears, and snakes is one of those things, okay? And so, and I think if I understand you correctly, I think you're kind of looking at, like, the evolutionary approach to that. And so if you're, which I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but an evolutionary psychologist, I believe, would totally agree with that. I tend to go more with that we're hardwired, okay, for certain fears. And people can understand being afraid of a snake, being afraid of a spider, but they think being afraid of things like the duvet on your bed to be unreasonable. So they might argue, well, that was a learned behavior. However, most of those kinds of behaviors tend to be come with maybe classical conditioning.
So you're saying you lean more to the acquired anxiety, like people see other people are afraid of snakes and spiders, and see it's reasonable for them to be afraid, so then they become afraid themselves.
Well, if there's an association. So when it comes to fears and those kinds of things, I'm more of a behaviorist. Okay, because so hey, I see this stimulus, I see this snake, then I get afraid, and then okay, well, the snake, I'm afraid, the snake, I'm afraid, and then because when I get afraid, then I do some kind of behavior that reinforces my fear. So when it comes to kind of like phobias, I'm more of a behaviorist or a cognitive behaviorist. I do think, yes, you can acquire that, but I think more that it's acquired through conditioning.
So basically you're saying like the fear of snakes, that could be reinforced, leading it to become a phobia.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Because what happens is that once we're afraid and we do something, like run away, then every time we avoid it, then it reinforces the fear, as opposed to addressing the fear. And so, again, depending on the association, how long we have the fear would depend on how long we've been reinforcing the fear.
It's like the same thing with like another anxiety disorder, panic attacks. Like some people get panic attacks in certain places, and then they have a fear of panic attacks, so they avoid that set.
Exactly. And so there's a difference between feeling panicky and actually having a panic attack. And so we can get panicky in that kind of way. And so if we have like that panic attack when we're out in open spaces, you can get diagnosed with agoraphobia with panic attacks. And so the actual not going out because of the panic attack reinforces the agoraphobia, but also reinforces the panic.
But since you said yourself, you're more of a behaviorist when it comes to like the theory of like phobias and whatnot. What about the research that identical twins usually gain similar phobias?
Well, in that case, I would still go with behavioral. However, the research on identical twins tend to show, in the Minnesota twin studies, that twins can actually, and this is genetically because they share the same DNA. Okay, could very well be afraid of the same snakes and phobias based on their genetic makeup. However, I'm still going to go with the exposure. Even if they both are afraid of the same thing. Okay, so how can you be afraid of something you've never come in contact with? Okay, so I'm still going to jump back with I'm not a hardcore behaviorist, but when it comes to phobias, I tend to be with it only because of that stimulus response. I've got to come in contact with something before I'm actually afraid of it. Yeah.
All right, that's all the questions.
That's all? Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
You're very insightful.